そういえば長い花の歌をご存知？ベルベルベルベルベット我が主長い花。
So these dancing noses popped up randomly online, and they're immediately recognizable as a symbol for a Jewish nose. That's not me saying that, that's the director who asked for these costumes, saying that the intention is to have a Jewish nose dancing, and on the faces of all performers. This is actually an old opera called The Nose, Nos, in Russian, as it was a story in Tsarist Russia and an opera in Communist Russia. In contrast, though, the new version of the opera for our era massively changes its imagery to make noses more Jewish and dance with the director excited about hairy legs, including one underage boy that he talks about in this interview.
I said, well, why don't we go the other way? Why don't we give everyone in the cast noses? So they've made, like, I think we have 100 and something people in the cast.
Goodness, yes.
Everyone has a nose, and when he loses his nose, he doesn't have the big nose. So we haven't. You have everyone has a latex nose, which was a morphed thing of Barbara Streisand's nose. And it's just true. Bookie Schiff and I did this. It's two things. Because it has to be a Jewish nose. I said, you know, so it's Barbara Streisand meets one of those terrible Nazi anti-Semitic Jewish banker caricatures from a newspaper in Berlin. And we morphed that. So we morphed Barbara and a sort of anti-Semitic Jewish banker, and we came up with that. And
a lot of them.
No, that's different. I'll get to that in a moment. So everyone wears these noses. So everyone's got the same nose, which makes it even weirder. And he loses his nose. And then there's a scene in which the nose runs around, and because I wanted dance to be quite an important element, we decided that the little nose for the first part of the show would be played by a young British tap dancing boy, because we've got a tap dancing nose in this show. And so this poor boy dreamed of Billy Elliot, but in fact he's just playing a nose. And then it grows into a sort of phantasmagoric scene where you will see the world's first Busby Berkeley tap dancing nose scene, where they tap dance in these noses. And I'm telling you, I don't know how they do it, because you can't really see out of it, and you can't look at your colleagues, so they have to all do it by some. But there's a sort of Busby Berkeley chorus line of hairy-legged male noses.
I mean, you can't sell a show better.
Yeah, well, that's worth the price of ticket alone, and that's not even with music. So
We also now have bearded women, cross-dressing men, black characters in what would otherwise be Russia, and this entirely phallic costume after being stripped. All of this is new. The original symbolism was just about a nose which grows huge, which allows it to achieve a high bureaucratic rank quickly, while the main character fails in society only after losing his nose. And with that narrative already, it seems too blatant, too theatric, especially in this new version, to be performed making its way around all of the Western world in recent years, right? We're at least supposed to think that it's a joke, right? Well, it got me thinking about this subject, talking about Jewish people versus talking about da Jews. And I think this is as good of an opportunity as any to explain what I mean by that and challenge myself with this. Before we engage with the surreal imagery, which is specifically imagery of da Jews that YouTube so kindly offered me, and that a Jewish director decided on having, first I'm going to explain statistically, per capita, why these noses are dancing. Maybe then we can see more why a Jewish director would like to make this opera and have the symbols in the way that he chose them. And we're going to start with Jewish sources. So the first thing I need to tackle is, are Jews biologically distinct in such a way that it could have a significant meaning? It could have a significant meaning to them, to us, to their average achievement. Let's read from Chabad.org, Are Jews a Race? One feature that stands out in the Jewish cluster, the average verbal IQ score among Jews is 120. Translate that into percentiles and we discover that the average Jew is a 1 out of 10, better than 91% of the population. That it may explain why Jews, at only 1.4% of the American population, make up 22% of Ivy League students, 20% of America's chief executives, and have earned 25% of the Nobel Prizes awarded to American scientists, not including Jews born outside the US such as Albert Einstein, since 1950, 32% worldwide in the 21st century, and 52% of Pulitzer Prizes for nonfiction. Now, just one side note there, the 120 IQ estimate is very high. It's not a common one, and there's plenty of other academics that we could refer to get a lower estimate. But we'll tackle a more direct comparison that might help us determine meritocracy momentarily. Continuing, but is it all in the genes? So far, no real evidence, no Jewish genes for IQ scores have turned up, nor for scientific innovation, although over 500 genes have been found related to intelligence, so we may not be far. Now, that's very interesting because I do very rarely hear that we found the genes for intelligence, because this would describe, in effect, a type of intelligence that is more commonly associated with one ethnic group or another, one race or another. But that is, of course, one of the most taboo subjects to consider significant intelligence differences between races based on genetics. Although here this scientifically taboo claim can just be put out there for everyone to see, but mainly just the Jewish readers. Continuing, neither do we know of any genetic basis for charitability. Yet Jews give far more charity than others in the same income bracket and make up a highly disproportionate number of America's leading philanthropists, 19 out of the top 53 and 5 out of the top 6 in 2015, according to the Chronicle of Philanthropy. All that geneticists know so far is that there's certainly a cluster of typical Jewish DNA. They've also been able to identify several distinct haplotypes, markers in the chromosome structure, that cropped up in one individual and have been passed on ever since. That allows them to approximate the age of these unique features, along with a good guess at the geographic origin. The time machine of our genes show that most Jews have a shared ancestry that traces back to ancient Israel. Any competing theories will have to argue with hard science. And just note there, it's very interesting that they have to sort of make that statement. I suppose they're trying to argue against the identity Christians, or the Palestinians, or the Black Hebrew Israelites. But what they absolutely don't have is genetics pulled from ancient skeletons that places them, and exclusively them, within this land of Israel, because even if you find a number of artifacts and skeletons, you're still not going to have just them in that area. You're going to have a mix of people. And especially, even if we look at the Bible, we can see that the narrative that they offer of being the chosen ones may not be too accurate, actually.
Children, and one of his descendants would be named Eber. He would be the father of the Hebrew people, and the Semites would be called by his name. Eber's line would eventually give birth to a man named Abram, or a Jew named Abraham, except Abraham has never been a Jew, nor will he ever be a Jew, and to call Abraham one is just plain ignorant, so let's go through it. So, according to the Bible, Abraham was a Hebrew and not a Jew, who God promised would be the father of many nations. Not one single Jewish nation, but many nations, and that through him all the families of the world would be blessed. Abraham would pass this blessing on to his younger son Isaac, and not his eldest son Ishmael. Isaac would have twin sons named Esau and Jacob. Again, the Abrahamic blessing would be passed down to the younger brother Jacob, who would then be renamed to Israel. Israel would then have 12 sons. His sons would each become their own tribes, and eventually become their own nations. One of his sons would be named Judah, who would be the father of the Jewish people, and all Jews are related to him. Even though all Jews are Israelites, majority of Israelites are not Jews. Obviously, Israel would have to pass the Abrahamic blessing to Judah in order for them to be the chosen people. Israel would want his favorite son Joseph to inherit the Abrahamic blessing. However, Judah, the father of the Jews, would be jealous and conspire with his brothers to have Joseph killed. In the end, Judah sold Joseph into slavery for silver, much like Judah sold Jesus to the Jews. So the Bible portrays Judah as a jealous villain and Joseph as the chosen son. While in slavery, Joseph would rise to become the prime minister of Egypt and father two sons named Ephraim and Manasseh. In the end, Israel would adopt Joseph's sons and pass the Abrahamic blessing on to them, making them the chosen people and dividing Joseph into 2 tribes, making 13 tribes of Israel. As for the father of the Jews, his 2 eldest sons would die and Judah would end up bowing down to Joseph. So, now that you understand that the Jews were never intended to bless the world, nor were they ever considered the chosen people, we can move on to our second point. So, is the Jewish homeland Israel? And the answer is yes and not at all. Israel was originally called the land of Canaan, named after Noah's grandson, Canaan. The land of Canaan was conquered by the Israelites after they left Egypt with Moses, found in the book of Exodus. The Bible says God commanded the Israelites to punish the Canaanites for their sexual immorality, which led to child sacrifice, which would eventually lead to cannibalism. The word cannibal actually comes from the words Canaan and the god Baal. Baal was the god of Canaan, and the priests were known for eating the children after they were sacrificed to him, hence why we call them cannibals. So now that you understand what kind of people were living in Canaan, try not to feel so bad when you read that God ordered us to exterminate them. The borders of the Jewish homeland were established by Joshua, who was one of the descendants of Joseph and not from Judah. So if we were to restore the Jews to their original land, according to the Bible, the Jewish homeland would look less like this and more like that. So, like the story of Joseph and Judah, their children likewise wouldn't get along either. After becoming nations, there would be a civil war. The Jews would rule the southern kingdom of Judea, while Joseph's sons would rule the northern kingdom, keeping the name Israel. They would have different religions, believe in different gods, and while Judah stayed in Judea, Joseph would ally himself with the Phoenicians and establish colonies and trade posts all over the Mediterranean. The kingdom of Israel would be corrupted by foreign ideologies, and like the Canaanites would fall into materialism, sexual immorality, and child sacrifice, which would lead to them being conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Some of the Israelites would be taken into captivity into the lands of Assyria and Media, while some of the Israelites and Phoenicians would flee to their colonies and trade posts, fulfilling the promise made to Abraham that the world would be blessed through him, as he would be the father of many nations. So the sons of Joseph would become fruitful and multiply among the nations, forgetting who they are, which shouldn't surprise us considering their names literally mean fruitful and forgetful. Just like the northern kingdom, the Jews would fall into sexual immorality and start sacrificing their children. They would be conquered and enslaved by the Babylonians, then freed and re-established by the Persians, conquered again by the Greeks, and later occupied by the Romans. While under Roman rule, the Jews would launch the greatest revolution in Roman history, known as the Great Revolt, which would fail, causing Judea, Jerusalem, and the Jewish temple to be destroyed, ironically fulfilling everything Jesus and the Christians said would happen. The Jews, not being satisfied with losing their temple and homeland, would stab the Romans in the back by launching 2 more rebellions, killing over 500,000 Greeks and Romans. God would bless the chosen people with 2 more humiliating defeats, along with a banishment from the land, causing Judea to be renamed to Syria Palestina. So the reason the Jews have been able to take Palestine really rests on the fact that they've stolen the name Israel and have convinced the Christian West that they are the chosen people and that they alone are Israel. But once putting things into perspective, we see that just isn't true.
But if we just take the narrative that the modern day Ashkenazi Jews especially are the actual Israelites and are the entirety of the tribes of Israel on their own, if we take that and accept it, that this genetic ancestry is so readily accepted, but they still feel the need to make this statement, should tell you that they still feel like it is an argument for some reason. But either way, what we can glean from this is that this is the way in which you can actually use your DNA to become part of Israel. This is part of the process. They do have a genetic test that lets you into the country, because Jewish ancestry is biologically distinct, and it has allowed for them to set up some of the functions of an ethnostate. And now from that biological basis, one of the reasons that I also read from this particular Jewish source is it does list off some of the key statistics of overrepresentation that we can consider as we move forward. Now, the gateway to overrepresentation in positions of power could certainly be considered the Ivy Leagues, and the original percentage that that Jewish site gave us for the percentage in Ivy Leagues was 22%. Now, turning instead to Ron Unz's write-up for the American Conservative, we see his estimates put the non-Jewish white percentage at 23% and also the Jewish at 23% in the Ivy League. Now that's particularly interesting for a number of reasons. Some of these schools, as you can see, we end up with more Jewish students in these schools than non-Jewish white students. This is even though we're going to have the estimate that the site gave us of 1.4% of the population being Jewish, and the non-Jewish white students still would be a majority, especially in the time period that Ron Unz is writing up for. And the article from Chabad is actually newer than this article. So we couldn't say necessarily that a lot has changed. Probably the Jewish percentages are still very high. But then you compare to some of these other schools, Caltech, MIT, Stanford, and you see that the Jewish percentages are considerably smaller. Still overrepresentation, but that amount of overrepresentation can be better understood as the actual merit, the actual intelligence, especially in the way that these other schools test and admit in comparison to the Ivy League, which seem to have such a heavy Jewish bias. Now, I know I already did a video on this, not knowing that these stats were already out there and explored more thoroughly. Maybe I'll remake that one. Though even there, with just me spending half a day to take available numbers and apply the information to college enrollments, I got similar stats. That should tell you how undeniable this overrepresentation is. And just look at the big one to highlight. 23% Jewish on the chart for Ivy League as Ron Unz breaks it down, and Chabad.org tells us it's 22%. So I guess one person is rounding up and one is rounding down, or it varies by year. But we only have 1%, only 1% difference in the statistics between what official Jewish websites say and what data divers who are inevitably smeared as horrible anti-Semites, even if they're Jewish, say. This information really isn't a secret. It's just that the approach to it is intended to be controlled such that we aren't unhappy about these disparities. That's exactly the difference between Jewish sites and people who are smeared as Nazis or anti-Semites. It's that Chabad.org and others set themselves up explaining that even though Jews are genetically distinct, have a higher IQ, and some studies have indicated genes and other groups associated with intelligence, it's best not to look at racial divides. Also, and more importantly, while they have to readily admit that there are these massive disparities, the justification is then the 120 IQ. But is that 120 IQ accurate? Again, no, it's not. A reasonable estimate from Richard Lynn in the 2006 book, Race Differences in Intelligence, page 94, claims that Ashkenazism in the US and Britain averaged 107 to 115. This is also reflected in Storfer's estimates for average Jewish IQ, and there he came up with 109 for verbal IQ, but tested for more abilities and came up with 102 overall. That between 107 and 115, that's one that's more common. Maybe 110 is a fairly common one too. But even there, with a lot of these claims, in IQ especially, I do have my reason to be more suspicious. Some of it's sample size, some of it's the level of variation from one test to another, and most of all, it's the political implications here. For me, I've developed a whole lot of suspicion when it comes to science that can be used so politically. But what works for some claims in racial science is how obvious racial differences are. Physically and in terms of typical observable actions, you can just meet people of different races, or ethnicities even, and note significant differences. So anyone can check some of these claims in racial science, and that's how most people can think if they are allowed to just notice patterns without some intellectual endlessly trying to confuse the obvious. This is why I don't like to fixate on IQ. For some of the simplest differences, I just like to look at skull shape and cranial capacity and see that there are significant differences. Whatever argument you want to have, then you should just think that there are differences. IQ's up, down, somewhere in between, but we're absolutely going to have differences. And significant differences that make people of different races form vastly different cultures. And well, when looking at this is where a big surprise comes in, kind of in contrast to some of these IQ studies when we're looking at Jewish brain size even. So, coming from Maurice Fishberg, a study called The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment. One of the methods of determining the volume of the brain case and approximating the weight of the brain is the determination of the cranial capacity. Very few direct measurements of this kind have been taken because only few Jewish skulls have found their way into anthropological museums where they could be studied carefully. But from the few studies of this charter that have been made, it appears that the Jews are somewhat at a disadvantage. Lombroso's studies of the Jews in Turin, Italy, which were made in an indirect fashion, showed that the Jews have a smaller cranial capacity than the Catholics of that city. Weinberg collected measurements of 17 Jewish skulls in various museums of Europe, which were made properly and are not approximations. The average cranial capacity was 1,421 cubic centimeters, which is about 30 to 40 cubic centimeters, below the average cranial capacity of the population of Europe. Of course, the smaller number of skulls thus measured is not sufficient to draw positive conclusions. As to the weight of the brain, there are also very few observations on record. The author knows only of 23 Jewish brains reported by Gilchenko, 4 by Weisbeck, 4, and 3 by Weinberg. 5, the average weight of these brains, as calculated by Weinberg, was 1,320.4 grams. Since the average weight of the brain of the European is 1,350 grams, the brain of the Jew is rather lighter by 30 grams, or nearly 1 ounce. Considering that the Jews are shorter of stature than the average European, it would be expected that their brain would also be smaller. But, as Weinberg points out, the average for Germans was found to be 8.22 gram of brain tissue for each centimeter of stature, which for Jews it is only 8.05 grams. This shows the Jewish brain lighter not only absolutely but also relatively. So given that, just as some tests, and for me confirmed by meeting Jewish people and noticing their head shape, this is indeed a bizarre anomaly. It is very odd that they have smaller and lighter brains. They're actually airheads to joke about it, yet they get such ludicrously high IQ scores when needed, I guess. Meanwhile, though, other academics do measure these other lower IQs. This is another reason we should be suspicious if we see significant overrepresentation in some elite positions, especially when there's supposed to be measured meritocracy like in the Ivy League. Let's continue with some of these more solid measurements of meritocracy. For comparison, looking at the National Merit Scholarship semifinalists, we see that Jewish people only make up 6% of these finalists, and it's actually pretty predictable. By states, we see that where there are a considerable number of Jews, say New York, you have a much larger percentage of Jewish people, and where you have a lot of Asian people, you have your higher percent of Asian people receiving these awards. But you do have a fair representation of white, non-Jewish students, and the 6% for Jewish students that we have overall is much more similar to those percentages we were seeing for schools such as Caltech, and in contrast to the 23% Jewish students that we have in the Ivy League schools. Looking at the Math Olympiad teams, we end up with something similar with the rapidly increasing number of Asian students and the rapidly decreasing number of Jewish students in the buildup of this team. And this would have to do with math IQ. Similar for College Putnam math winners. Then we have U.S. Physics Olympiad winners, also similar. Science Olympiad winners, similar. And then finally the Science Talent Search finalists, which is again similar. Altogether, this method of approximating the actual skill of whites, Asians, and Jews relatively gives us the impression that potential Jewish skill is overrepresented in the Ivy League, especially recently. And keep in mind, for the percentages of overrepresentation that Chabad gave us, the Ivy League percentages are some of the less extreme disparities. And if we do correct for averages, looking at per capita, then we're actually having a very simple overrepresentation conversation, just like when we talk about per capita crime rates, which is a conversation that we really needed to have. Taking any look at white versus black crime, we have per capita much more significant crime within the black community. Similar, we end up with this chart, but see, this chart I'm kind of pulling your leg. It's actually, again, from Ron Unz initially, and it's about Jewish representation, their overrepresentation relative to other equally qualified applicants, as far as they can tell. And even then, I'm lying because I took away some of the initial symbolism and just photoshopped it to say Jewish instead of having the Star of David. So this is just a consideration of how we represent it. Ultimately, we're unfortunately primed to see a lot of this symbolism and think anti-Semitic, just as in the case of the dancing noses, when there could be a very real story behind this kind of information. So Ronan's article on this is entitled The Myth of American Meritocracy, and that's a great title. It's revealing because the point offered by such statistics is that when you have a nation of diverse ethnicities, if some ethnicities act with greater group self-interest than others, the goal ceases to be having a meritocracy. As simple as that. If some groups have greater self-interest than others, ultimately, if group self-interest exists, really, the goal of any group is to subvert that meritocracy to benefit their own kind. Well, we have in-group preference studies, and naturally, white people are currently losing this game significantly because we have been the target to not have in-group preference at all. It's been trained out of us, punished out of us. And if we recognize that on average, ethnic groups are competing against us as well as each other for power, but we're the defined target, our next question is, who has been the most effective at subverting meritocracy for their own gain? Well, that's precisely a place where it's very useful to separate Jewish ethnicity from people of more European ancestry and culture, because that's the power transition, and it is certainly not the same identity. If we do, we can see through large disparities. Now, I want to dive a bit deeper into this, and especially focus on these elements of power. So, looking over this chart on the diversity of CEO positions, we see the ever-increasing diversity in America of CEO positions. But by diversity, they're clearly just missing one group, which is the white group, and that is still missing 2 or so ethnicities, being white non-Jewish and Jewish. So if I plug in the 20% that Chabad gave us in the prior reading about Jews and their race, we see that actually the white percentage of CEOs is 26%, and you end up with Hispanic 19%, Black 5%, and significantly Asian or Indian 30%. So how do you see this? If we believe that the Jewish percentages by Chabad are accurate, then they do not hold more power currently than white Americans do. You know, on my channel, I'm always generous though. I do have my doubts about these numbers that they gave us, just like the IQ numbers they provided are definitely incorrect. But for this argument, let's take these numbers as accurate. Well, it is reasonable, I'll say, especially looking at the Ivy League percentages, but ultimately, this is a demonstration of representation and power. Could we also be worried about the largest group of CEOs, Asians? They are overrepresented, but not to the same degree as Jews are in the CEO positions. That's about a 7% population Asian and a 1.4% or more 2% for a Jewish population. So yes, the Jewish people are the most overrepresented again, but they do not necessarily constitute a majority, less of a majority than Asians. My answer to this is, well, consider all these groups and their power. First, consider how underrepresented the ethnic majority of the nation are in CEO positions. That'd be non-Jewish whites. And this underrepresentation, even though we have to constantly hear about diversifying these exact same CEO positions. Second, what we haven't had from our white CEOs is advocating for white interests, for our health. All these other ethnic CEOs can advocate for the interests of their own people, and just in doing that, their interests do not align with our own. In positions of power, we have already been made a minority without people in power pushing on our behalf as these other CEOs do for their own demographic. There's a reason for this, and another aspect to this, which is the question, what industries do these CEOs tend toward? For the white CEOs, are we largely talking about more solid industry? And for Jewish CEOs, are they more represented in communication and entertainment media? And especially, does this power within media control a lot of the public conversation such that our remaining white CEOs will not risk openly supporting white interests? Short answer, yes. For me, it's particularly frustrating to hear for so many years that these CEO jobs must be diversified. I don't know why, but they must be. But are they then firing Jewish CEOs also who are the most overrepresented of all? No, this would give you a clear impression that diversity is highly useful in removing white people from positions of power, and only white people from opportunities and that power. Given though that Jewish people do look white, we can still hear about white CEOs, even long after we're underrepresented. We can see them as white people, but when these same people push for less white executives, still we know well which demographic it will disproportionately affect, and the net effect is who is left in the positions of power that has any interest in maintaining white America? An answer, not really anyone. You know, the leftists and their particular concern with demographics that have more wealth, more executive positions in America do make sense to that extent. They understand that people in positions of influence might benefit their own people, but yet white leftists, referring to non-Jewish people here, are still backwards as all these companies support their anti-white tantrums. And as ordinary white people, we don't believe in their narrative simply because we feel from our own perspective that white people are under attack and quite obviously don't have power. But with that, it's also important that we don't fall into the Republican narrative, because why should we all compete within the same nation? Especially if we can sense that white people are already so underrepresented in positions of power and something seriously wrong has happened where all of these corporations seem desperate to attack us while we are underrepresented and suffering within this system. It's clear that meritocracy within a globalized nation has no interest in preserving us or our way of life. It's just a false term used to placate us as we are displaced. Let's look more at the politics that form this condition. And in doing so, let's try to figure out what these people think about us. One of the most surprising findings from public opinion comes from a 2014 Pew Research poll, and this one has a series of different groups asked to give their ratings of other groups, and we can then compare who thinks what of whom. And for here, white evangelicals rated Jews particularly highly. Everyone rated Jews fairly highly, but in contrast, Jewish people thought most highly of themselves, and some of the least highly that they thought of were evangelical Christians at only 34. That's even less than Muslims. Evangelical Christians are in fact the least liked of the Jewish people surveyed. Also surprising there is that Jewish people surveyed thought relatively highly of Catholics at 58, a little bit more highly than Hindus by 1 point. But overall, the key takeaway from this survey is that Jews as well as atheists you'll note at 82, but especially Jews at 89, think most highly of themselves, and the admiration that white evangelicals give to Jewish people is certainly not requited. Per capita, we could certainly say the majority of Jewish people do not like Christians, period. And this is certainly a even more difficult sentiment when I think about how many white people, white Christians especially, have gone off to wars in the Middle East, which ultimately did not benefit us at home in America, but did benefit the expansion of Israel. And people have died in those wars. But in contrast to this level of self-sacrifice exhibited so consistently by the not self-interested white race, we can see how interested the Jewish people are in themselves repeatedly through a number of surveys. So, reading here. First, the Midas study asked participants, how closely do you identify with your race? On a 4-point scale, and the mean Jewish score was 0.2 standard deviations above the mean. Secondly, the inductivist got data that asked people to rate on a 4-point scale how important their ethnicity is to who they are, with 1 being very important and 4 being not at all important. Jews' score was 0.29 standard deviations below the mean, indicating greater ethnocentrism than average. Thirdly, the midlife development in the United States study asked Americans how important it is for members of their ethnic group to marry inside their group. Here are the percentages who said very important or somewhat important. And to summarize those results, Jewish people were the most preferential for their own ethnicity maintained through marriage at 47.4%, and of course, different white ethnic groups came in at the very bottom of this preference, with English being the top at 28.4%, but all other groups being below 20%. Continuing. Fourthly, from the inductivist analysis of GSS data, the following proportions of people said that they did not prefer the company of their own ethnic group at all. And here Again, white ethnic groups from Europe rank the highest in at least saying that they don't have a preference for their own ethnic group, while Jewish rank the lowest here at 20.2%. Thus, Jews are more likely than various white ethnic groups to prefer the company of their co-ethnics, at least according to the reports. But keep in mind, we're just constantly barraged with the propaganda against white people having their own ethnic self-interest, so this really isn't too surprising, especially that it gives the reason for white people in particular, but not for other ethnic groups, to lie on this type of survey. We can say often enough that liberals are very racially aware. We use that you're the real racist thing if you're in the wrong circles. But the thing is, white people are very racially aware. It's just such a taboo, but only a taboo for white people, unfortunately, which is quite difficult to get white people to understand that they are not in control of this, that this is actually dangerous, that it is weaponized specifically against them. But even more studies on who has a lot of ethnic self-interest and makes sure to help their own ethnicity. So reading from a 2001 National Jewish Population Survey found that 52% of Jews say that half or more of their close friends are Jewish, 41% contribute money to a specifically Jewish cause, and 52% regard being Jewish as very important. In 2013, Pew polling found that 80% of Jews said that being Jewish was either somewhat or very important, so far greater than the 52% there. Figures from the annual survey of American Jewish opinion put that figure at 79% in 2016 and 80% in 2017. That same Pew polling also found that 75% of American Jews have a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. 63% say they have a special responsibility to care for Jews in need. 32% of Jews say that all or most of their friends are Jewish. 45% say some are Jewish, and 21% say hardly any or none of their friends are Jewish. So just average Jews per capita have a very, very strong sense of self-interest, self-group interest. And does this then translate into political influence, political power? And how's that been working? Well, let's read a little bit more. Another analysis found Jews to account for 8% of U.S. senators between 1989 and 1991 and 9% of U.S. Supreme Courts between 1900 and 1990, corresponding to factors of overrepresentation of 3.6 and 3. Today, Jews comprise 5.6% of the U.S. House of Representatives, 9% of the Senate, and 38% of the Supreme Court. Since Jews account for 2.2% of the population, this corresponds to factors of overrepresentation of 2.5 for the House, 4 for the Senate, and 17.27 for the Supreme Court. But that's of course just the face. The big question is the money. So Jews are even more present among political donors. In 2012, Jews accounted for 20% of the top 5 GOP donors and 40% of the top Democratic donors. In 2016, Jews accounted for all 5 of the top Democrat donors. One analysis finds that of the top 50 donors in 2016, Jews accounted for 40% of mega donors in total, 25% of Republican donors, and 79% of Democrat donors. So that big jump to, you'll note, 2016, that's when Donald Trump was running. That's when things started to get serious and started to look like we might have a politician that just might care about white people. Also interesting politically is if we look at history and reading. The Washington Post made a list of their top 28 communists of all time, and 32% were Jewish. Forbes created a list of 25 most influential liberals in the U.S. media, and 56% were Jewish. Only 4 or 16% were Gentile whites. Now, here I also want to cover the Federal Reserve. That's been a big one that's been thrown around, but I want to do it in statistics. So, National Alliance reviewed the list of chairmen during the entirety of its existence and took into account the time that each of these chairmen had control, and found that during the entire existence of the Federal Reserve, there was a Jewish chairman for 46.51% of the time. And if we just consider after 1970, there were Jewish chairmen for 96.16% of the time. For comparison, I also read the article by the ADL on this subject. They called it Canard, of course. And they included useful quotes such as this from Eustace Mullins. The American people have assumed the burden of hundreds of billions of dollars of debt simply because we let a handful of enemy aliens take over our monetary system. The three most important architects of our present monetary system are Paul Warburg, the German Jew who wrote the Federal Reserve Act, Emanuel Goldwasser, and the Russian Jew who supervised the details of Federal Reserve Board operations through its first 30 years, and Harry Dexter White, son of Lithuanian Jews who set up the International Monetary Fund. Now, all of these are true. This article does not respond to Eustace Mullins, very tellingly. It really doesn't respond anywhere to that, or to how many Jewish people have been the chairman of the Federal Reserve. This article even quotes the Nation of Islam, but simply calls all of this anti-Semitic. They do not even try to prove the Nation of Islam incorrect. And I would think if you can argue with anyone here, you'd be able to argue that the Nation of Islam is not correct. Now, to this point, we've talked a good amount about money, and we've talked about the CEOs, but some of this overrepresentation can be even more severe when we look at the richest people in the whole world. For 2009, the Forbes 400 of wealthiest included at least 139 Jewish people, which is about 35%. On this same list, at least 20 of the top 50 were Jewish, which would be 40%. And for the wealthiest, this one sourced from the Times of Israel, that for 2018, the Forbes list that 5 out of the top 10 of the all wealthiest in the world were Jewish, which includes Jewish tech owners of Facebook, Google, and Oracle. So have you seen censorship on these sites? Just try this. Post a YouTube video claiming that black people commit a lot of crime, and post a YouTube video about Jewish people having a disproportionate amount of power, and watch which one gets you a strike. Both subjects are of course taboo, even though both are quantifiable, measurable. But depending on what you're posting, I know well enough which one will be struck quickly. But just try it if you doubt the stats I'm giving you. Coincidentally, Susan Wojcicki is Jewish. For San Francisco, in particular, My Jewish Learning comes up with an estimate for population, which is 6% within the city itself are Jewish. But now, with a current day 6% in the area, this is a higher density of Jewish people than most cities. But it is revealing in that density alone does not account for the number of powerful positions that Jewish people hold in Silicon Valley. And this is from the 2019 article for the 25 richest people in Silicon Valley by Business Insider. Just going through this article and checking links, I found any solid evidence that I could of ancestry. So think of this actually as the Jewish minimum of the wealthiest in Silicon Valley. Take, for example, Robert Pera, who very much has Jewish features, but with Pera being an Italian name, Italians at least do have a lot of genetic relationship to Ashkenazi Jews, so we could have these features without any particular Jewish identity. But again, just as a solid minimum from this list, we have 44% of the wealthiest are Jewish in a city that is only 6% Jewish. I'll also point out that this is just an approximation of power. George Lucas may be very wealthy, but how powerful do we really think he is in controlling narrative? There are no white advocacy groups here. None of these wealthy people donating to white interests, unlike the extensive donations that we read Jewish people do for Jewish interests. And even Eric Schmidt here takes pro-Jewish actions. There might be some people here who might have real concerns for white people somewhere in their mind, but the proof of real power is not just wealth, it's proof in the current narrative and censorship, meaning extensive censorship of mentioning Jewish power while encouraging hatred of white people, and these people can be reached. So just evidence of results here, it doesn't make sense for white people in power to support movements and narratives that promote hatred of white people, unless they themselves believe that they and their family are not white and have already benefited from the weakening of white people. For manipulating this further, keep in mind that these corporations have Jewish and other diverse board members and CEOs who have been advocating for their own ethnic interests with greater in-group preference than white people have had for generations. And continuing on, this actually fits into a historical trend of media control. Looking at these percentages derived from older studies, we end up with some percentages of the journalists in particular countries during some historical periods, especially important historical periods. So Austria 1873 to 1910, was 57% Jewish. Hungary 1900, 42% Jewish. Austria 1873 to 1910, 57% of journalists were Jewish. Hungary 1900, 42% of journalists were Jewish. And then Hungary 1920, 43% of journalists were Jewish. Poland 1931, 22% of journalists were Jewish. And then finally Romania 1937, 70% of journalists were Jewish. So at that point they had, in some of these areas, significant control. And more recently we have page 309 of Lynn 2011 reported on 5 analyses of Jewish representation among media elites in contemporary America. For 1975, the media elite were 26% Jewish. 1980, the media elite were 30% Jewish. For Hollywood movies in 1980, it was 66% Jewish actually. And 1980 Hollywood TV was 46% Jewish. And then we ended up with the 1994 New Establishment was 48% Jewish. Now, even here, this helps us quantify overrepresentation and estimate Jewish cultural influence through media, but something that you'll find is that different people on these lists have different levels of influence, and that's harder to quantify. I want to take Broadway as an example.
If you're all white in America.
Now here's my question. What do the following have in common?
Irving Berlin, George and Ira Gershwin, Richard Rodgers, Lawrence Hart, Oscar Hammerstein, Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Sondheim. The list goes on and on.
Yes, they're musical titans, everyone. And they also happen to be Jewish.
If I were a rich man,
Watching the BBC documentary, Broadway, A Jewish Legacy, you may get the impression that all famous musicals were written by Jewish people unless they have Andrew Lloyd Webber's name on it. Well, even then, this documentary has an incomplete list. A longer list is right here, and just at a glance, this confirms what I just said as not being an exaggeration, and I do mean that. But even then, this list is incomplete. Andrew Lloyd Webber had a Jewish man, Hal Prince, commonly working with him as director and producer for more famous musicals such as Evita and Phantom of the Opera. And certainly, in terms of further promoting Jewish music, Jewish musicians, it is worth noting that by percentage, the awards given to Jewish musicians are disproportionate, sometimes overwhelming. Here we have Jewish recipients of the Academy Award for Best Original Music were 46% of the recipients. The recipients of the Academy Award for Best Musical Scoring of a Motion Picture were 48% Jewish. The recipients of the Antoinette Perry or Tony Award for Best Musical Production, 61% Jewish. And the recipients of the Antoinette Perry Tony Award for Best Original Score of a Musical were 67% Jewish. Tony's so Jewish. I think that'll be a good hashtag. So certainly Broadway, A Jewish Legacy is undeniable. It is correct to point out the dominance, especially in famous shows, and the other impression you might get is that when Jewish people have this level of influence in a form of entertainment, they steadily look for ways to push boundaries and encourage changes within the country, as they say explicitly in some of these interviews.
The musical represents mainstream America. And I think that when a people are presented on Broadway and accepted on Broadway, groups that were formerly viewed with suspicion have a shot at acceptance, a way in. And this is largely because of what Jews did to create the musical.
Concentrated on normalizing and making central ethnic groups or sexualities that were not fundamental to building up a formerly white country, and that former culture that was the core of that country being successful. These changes through entertainment might be more subtle looking back at past generations, but they were there, especially the big one being the deconstruction of America as being based on the core ethnic group that actually built it up, that led it in its values. Similarly, Christmas songs would seemingly be culture most associated with white Christians, especially during the time that most of the current popular ones were written in. Jewish World Review, another Jewish source, writes that the lion's share of enduring Christmas hits were composed between about 1920 to 1965. That is the songwriting era that produced what is now called the Great American Songbook. About 75% of all songbook hits, now referred to as standards, were written by Jewish songwriters. For Christmas songs specifically, they took the American Society of Composers and Publishers list of the top holiday or Christmas songs based on amount of radio airplay, and for 2014 they found that 15 of the top 30 songs were written or co-written by Jewish people. So that's 50%, guys. That's half. And with a note that George Michael has at least claimed a Jewish mother, though the article argues that she is not Jewish. If she were, that would bring the total of Jewish Christmas songs to 16 out of 30. And looking over the list either way, it's clear that these songs do secularize the music of what is otherwise a particularly Christian and religious time of year. Since Jewish people do not celebrate Christmas, I can't imagine a reason for such significant involvement in Christmas songs unless there actually is a goal to alter the cultural nature of this holiday, especially to reduce Christian traditions in Christmas. This type of interest in and changing of white cultural traditions that Jewish people do not themselves have should make you curious as we investigate media and entertainment more closely, asking ourselves, what do Jewish representatives in media want for white people in the future? This is likely a question too for the significant cultural differences between Jewish people and white European Americans. But certainly it is a mistake to view Jews as of the same ethnic group if they view themselves in opposition to you. You might initially recognize that Jewish people learn a history of being kicked out of numerous European countries, kicked out over 100 times, and being murdered in pogroms and the Holocaust. Whether you believe that actually these actions were historically warranted or often exaggerated, made up to abuse sympathy, it is true that this is a cultural history, a narrative, which allows Jewish people to define themselves in opposition to people of European descent specifically. Now, for me, I certainly don't believe that they experience hardships, and I would have to imagine that at some level they're conscious of this, the same as I believe that black people know that they're not oppressed. Simple enough, why do these two groups concentrate so much on being close to white people? Having more access to white people when black people have the black nationalism or back to Africa movements as options, and Jewish people have all of Israel. Obviously, neither group feels genuinely oppressed currently or threatened yet by being around white people. On the contrary, they are chasing white people down as white people engage in white exodus further and further out of cities. And more specifically even, what do Jewish people think about you whites? Well, a 2009 Quinnipiac University poll asked if affirmative action programs that give preference to blacks and other minorities should be continued. The general public favored abolishing such programs by a margin of 19 points, while Jews favored continuing such programs by a margin of 4 points. When asked if affirmative action policies were worth pursuing, even if they resulted in fewer opportunities for whites, the general public said no by a margin of 30 points. Jews said yes by a margin of 9 points. Note that the general public increased its opposition to these programs when it was specified that whites would be hurt by affirmative actions, and Jews actually did the opposite. So a majority of the Jewish community actually do seek to disadvantage white people. It is significant. The poll also asked participants whether they favored affirmative action in hiring, promotions, and college admissions for three groups: blacks, Hispanics, and white women, in order to increase diversity. The general public opposed this by a margin of 28 points in the case of blacks, 30 points for white women, and 35 points for Hispanics. Jews favored such policies by a margin of 7 points for Hispanics and 13 points for blacks, and opposed it by a margin of 8 points for white women. That said, why even do this? Why have a diverse nation in the first place? What are you trying to accomplish? And also, when you do give advantage to all other groups except for the majority, then the only thing that you could expect is significant changes. You certainly have no chance of conserving, so it really doesn't make sense to do this unless it is intended to harm the majority. So given just desiring to maintain a country, a space for your family, your extended family, your children, I think that there actually is a much better system, and actually it comes from Jews in Israel. Pew polling finds that 79% of Israel Jews think that Jews should get preferential treatment in Israel. Now, this opinion from within Israel just represents really any population that actually has a country that actually cares about themselves at all, having a country in the future. So where did Western nations get such suicidal ideas to the contrary? An obvious center of propaganda would be Hollywood, which applies for ourselves and for people coming into the country. After all, how many immigrants get their ideas of what America is through Hollywood, even if that view of America is based on diverse cities with hefty percentage of Jewish influencers in Hollywood? This can be confirmed by a Jewish writer for Los Angeles Times, who, from a conversation with ADL chairman Abe Foxman, decided that it would be best for people to say that Hollywood executives happen to be Jewish, in quotes, as in, quote, all 8 major film studios are run by men who happen to be Jewish. Keep in mind, the ADL Anti-Defamation League is a Jewish organization originally founded in response to a Jewish murdering pedophile, Leah Frank, being hung. Other enlightening quotes from that particular article include, when the studio chiefs took out a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times a few weeks ago to demand that the Screen Actors Guild settle its contract, the open letter was signed by News Corp President Peter Chernin, Jewish, Paramount Pictures Chairman Brad Gray, Jewish, Walt Disney Co. Chief Executive Robert Iger, Jewish, Sony Pictures Chairman Michael Linton, surprise, Dutch Jew, Warner Bros. Chairman Barry Meyer, Jewish, CBS Corp. Chief Executive Leslie Moonves, so Jewish his great-uncle was the first Prime Minister of Israel, MGM Chairman Harry Sloan, Jewish, and NBC Universal Chief Executive Jeff Zucker, mega-Jewish. If either of the Weinstein brothers had signed, this group would have not only the power to shut down all film production, but to form a minyan with enough Fiji water on hand to fill a mikvah. Also, in terms of this cultural manipulation through Hollywood, to quote one particular part, the ADL poll, he pointed out, showed that 59% of Americans think Hollywood execs do not share the religious and moral values of most Americans, and 43% think the entertainment industry is waging an organized campaign to weaken the influence of religious values in this country. And at the end of this article, another quote, I appreciate Foxman's concerns, and maybe my life spent in a New Jersey, New York, Bay Area, LA, pro-Semitic cocoon has left me naive. But I don't care if Americans think we're running the news, media, Hollywood, Wall Street, or the government. I just care that we get to keep running them. And this is, again, appearing in LA Times from a Jewish writer. And from here, we have even more data. It just keeps going and going. In the 1988 book, The Media Elite, America's New Power Brokers, Lichter, Rothman, and Lichter report on a representative survey of 238 journalists from America's top news organizations, which found that 59% of respondents were Jewish. A 1990 list of the top 10 U.S. entertainment companies published in American Film found that Jews accounted 8 of their 10 CEOs. Lynn, 2011. The companies were Time Warner, Paramount, CBS, Fox, Columbia Pictures, Viacom, ABC, and MCA Inc. So of course, since then, they have maintained that level of influence and in fact increased it by the time of the LA Times article making the claim that just 8 out of the 8 most important studios are headed by Jews. And certainly if you're looking for thinking that is even more radical, even more avant-garde than the Hollywood studios would be willing to put on a screen, you can always go to the universities. So Jewish overrepresentation in America becomes more extreme when we look at more elite categories of academics. From Zuckerman 1977 found Jews had a factor of overrepresentation of 3 when looking at all university faculty, but that figure jumped to 7 when the analysis was restricted to elite universities. Below are the results broken down by subject for fields that Jews were heavily represented in, and this of course goes back to how Ivy League, the most elite universities especially, will tend toward Jews for some unknown reason. But here the breakdown is law faculty 36% Jewish. Sociology faculty, 34% Jewish. Economics faculty, 28% Jewish. Physics faculty, 26% Jewish. Political science faculty, 24% Jewish. History faculty, 22% Jewish. Philosophy faculty, 20% Jewish. And mathematics faculty, 20% Jewish. So law, sociology, economics, but especially law, sociology, that's the fields that they're most dominant in. The stereotypes remain true. And since this was 1977, we could actually assume that it may have very well increased since then. I would say it's very likely, especially given the way that Ivy Leagues search for students. But from within that time period of the 1970s alone, we actually have a little bit of evidence that within those schools, the Jewish staff had a lot more influence than the non-Jewish staff, at least in terms of published papers. From Conducian 1974 analyzed the authors who were recently published in the top 20 academic journals in America and found that Jews accounted for 50% of intellectuals, 56% of social scientists, and 61% of humanities scholars. Thus, if you use a sufficiently elite criterion, there is a sense in which certain fields in academia could be described as being mostly or largely controlled by Jews. As in, they are pushed forward as the thought leaders very disproportionately, even if you look at how disproportionate they already are within these staffs. This is the reason also for my naming of this video, that there is a lot of power in the Jewish community, but it's primarily concentrated in media and academia. This power, though, does not have the power of numbers that they wish to project. In terms of elite control also, this power in Western countries working against the interest of Western people depends on the cooperation of many non-whites in being against us to make an anti-white majority, which is then so powerful. And that's just the natural way people are. Who else has a vested interest in preserving your way of life? But it's inevitably not going to work smoothly. A lot of the power that Jewish people have depends on impression, on creating narratives to their benefit. And just like that conversation with Abe Foxman and Joel Stein, there's debate whether Jewish power should be celebrated or the information censored. It certainly is undeniable, but which approach would more upset the majority of people? And that this debate is an important one for them shows that they are afraid. I'm certain that awareness of Jewish power has only increased as both censorship and celebration continues. And this is where the Jewish people hold power, a power in significant self-interest, but never a power in numbers. Even in the industries they tend towards, so much of it is in communication. They love to control stories, narratives. But we do not need to communicate through their means, which has led to so much censorship, especially censorship of content that encourages white collective interests. In order for our continuation and independence from this system, our first step in helping ourselves is to develop a strong group interest, strong communities to help and defend each other first, with the core being large, healthy family units and value, love, and truth. This is something that we have been very good at historically, and I do firmly believe we can do this again. Just recognizing our own value and loving our own people, defending ourselves, but we must cut through the anti-white narrative, knowing that this media and politics are indeed anti-white, and we have been fooled into thinking that us of European descent have as large a percentage of our people in positions of power as our percentages in the general population. Just anecdotally, I note when I'm talking to a lot of liberals, when they're white liberals, and I mean legitimately white, that there's still an element of safety. They're concerned still about really silly things like bad, mean words, and people feel bad. They're not concerned about safety yet because they don't realize ultimately that they're not in power. They don't realize yet how significantly their race has been stripped of this power, so they don't have a good idea of what happens next. They don't understand how unstable this system is because they still feel like even if they denounce white people, it'll be okay if white people still have power. It's kind of like an oddity within their head, but it helps them say something that is clearly anti-white while being white and still helps them to feel safe. Well, when you realize, though, that Jewish people see themselves as a distinct ethnic group, they hold so much more power proportionately, and certainly their self-interests are pushed forward, that sort of really messes with the liberal impression of the world. And it probably makes them feel like there's something really wrong in how they've been thinking. At least that's the intention. But even for the civic nationalists, when it comes up, they need to understand that there's no safety in this system for white people. There's no safety left because there's not the power left for white people, white Western people, that they're led to believe there is. This deception has significant social implications in our current political shift against our interests and stretches through history. Let's also look at the civil rights movement, which was fundamental in deconstructing the identity of Western nations as being dependent on the Western people who traditionally defined them, who built them up. And let's start it by going back to Jewish sources again. So from myjewishlearning.com, Jewish participation in the civil rights movement far transcended institutional associations. One black leader in Mississippi estimated that in the 1960s, the critical decade of voter registration drives, as many as 90% of the civil rights lawyers in Mississippi were Jewish. Large numbers of them were recent graduates of Ivy League law schools. They worked around the clock, analyzing welfare standards, the bail system, arrest procedure, justice of the peace rulings. Racing from one southern town to another, they obtained parade permits and issued complaints on jail beatings and intimidation. These were the people, it is recalled, who were the earliest supporters of the fledgling National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They made it, actually. In 1914, Professor Emeritus Joel Spingarn of Columbia University became chairman of the NAACP and recruited for its board such Jewish leaders as Jacob Schiff, Jacob Billenkopf, and Rabbi Stephen Wise. Jews also were the earliest supporters of the Urban League, founded in New York in 1911 to help newly arrived black migrants from the rural South. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers took the lead in organizing Our Black Brothers for union membership over the opposition of the American Federation of Labor National Board. And of course, that's in part because people really like to keep their jobs. Pretty basic in that way. And in the climatic civil rights drives of the 1950s and 1960s, Jewish participation was all but overwhelming. In the landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling itself, the Supreme Court accepted the research of the black sociologist Kenneth Clark that segregation placed the stamp of inferiority on black children. Clark's study had been commissioned by the American Jewish Committee and appeared in the amicus curiae brief the committee submitted to the court. The Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Congress also submitted amicus curiae briefs in behalf of this cause. Once the judgment was issued, these Jewish defense organizations continued to file legal briefs in civil rights cases dealing with housing, employment, education, and public accommodation. Many local and state desegregation regulations were actually drafted in the offices of the Jewish agencies. So certainly it's safe to say that because of Jewish litigation, it suddenly became wrong for white people to have their own spaces, and it depended on the deconstruction of the idea of a nation as being dependent on the people within that nation. You could just exchange people from here to there, and there wasn't really a significant difference between one country and another, you could basically say. And there wasn't a significant difference between one continental population and another continental population, which is exactly then how we get the insane idea that it is okay to have immigration from a completely foreign nation into the Western world. And the most important part of all is to deconstruct the Western world such that white people are uniquely not allowed to have freedom of association, even if the rest of the world is allowed to have freedom of association. But with that, even more stats. During the civil rights movement, Jewish activists represented a disproportionate number of whites involved in the struggle. Jews made up half of the young people who participated in the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. Leaders of the Reform movement were arrested with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine, Florida in 1964 after a challenge to racial segregation in public accommodations. Most famously, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched arm in arm with Dr. King in his 1965 March on Selma. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in the conference room of Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism under the aegis of the Leadership Conference, which for decades was located in the RAC's building. The Jewish community has continued its support of civil rights laws addressing persistent discrimination in voting, housing, and employment against not only women and people of color, but also in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community and the disabled community. Note too that when polled, Jews do have some of the most liberal views on sexuality of all. In my MLK video, though, I highlighted the parallels between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, not just in the secrecy of communist connections, but fully on display in King's pro-wealth redistribution, anti-police brutality, pro-reparations, pro-social justice speeches. So what does this mean in modern times? Well, I've offered you modern statistics. So if Jewish representation during civil rights activism constituted over half of the white-looking people in some scenarios, could it still be holding true today? The short answer is most definitely. And keep in mind, for per capita, how small the population of the Jewish people is versus the majority, and past supermajority of European-descended people in America. Let's look at Antifa in particular here. I'm sure you've seen those accusations from comments, but is there anything to it? Well, a 2017 article from The Forward, a Jewish news source, explains both the Jewish historical inspiration of Antifa through Antifa in Germany prior to World War II, and the current appeal of the organization to Jews, including several large groups of Antifa organization that are outwardly Jewish, including Jewish Antifa with over 2,000 followers on Facebook, and Muju Antifa, which is a Muslim Jewish Antifa alliance with over 2,700 followers on Facebook. This in turn led me to further Jewish Antifa organizations, including Outlive Them NYC, also Jewish, and actually Outlive Them is derived from a Jewish phrase, which is racial in nature. It's essentially pro-genocide. You know, it's saying our race is going to outlive your race. That's what it means. Though, for comparisons, the largest online presence for Antifa and other associated movements is It's Going Down, with 95,000 followers on Twitter currently. And Unicorn Riot is also huge, potentially even bigger in terms of some of the followers. This is the main page, though, on their website. Another Jewish news source, Haaretz, just came out with an opinion article called Trump's Attack on Antifa Are Attacks on Jews. So I basically take it as confirmed. I would also like to briefly point out that in my research, the by far most cited Antifa expert within left-wing sources was Mark Bray, a college lecturer at Dartmouth, organizer of Occupy Wall Street, and author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. A quick look over his Twitter, and he is also Jewish. The story of his ancestry coming up after a probable hate hoax. What you doing, Rabbi? Well, I don't have enough Antifa data yet to decide a particular percentage of Jewish people making up Antifa's ranks, and BLM for that matter. I'll say this much. I could not find a black Antifa or Latino Antifa or any other particular ethnic group Antifa within the US. I did find Antifa all over the world. But within the borders of the US, it should be clear that there is Jewish overrepresentation expressed by the multiple known Jewish Antifa organizations, and for that matter, Jewish media such as Haaretz and The Forward readily proclaiming Antifa as Jewish. Thank you for that, guys. If Jewish news will make these claims that Antifa is Jewish, I certainly don't feel like I'm overestimating. But I do like stats, and especially stats that might help us guess at what happens next. I believe that an event more violent than the civil rights movement, which it is worth noting, was also marked by very violent riots, was the Spanish Civil War, though. The Spanish Civil War was defined by nationalists who were supported by Mussolini and Hitler. On the other side, you had socialists, communists, Zionists, and this included the International Brigade, an organization set up by Communist International made up of many countries. And during the Spanish Civil War, we have this compiled estimate from Jewish Virtual Library that 25% of the army, or a bit less, though possibly even more due to how Jewish people tend to change their names, were Jewish. And just one note here for this particular statistic is that I believe that the International Brigade numbers are relatively accurate, though if anything, they're going to be on the lower end just because of not being able to determine all of the Jews within the International Brigade, but for the ones that we could determine, they're determined by each person, and thus the 38% that they offer for the US seems to be about correct. However, the 4% they offer for population is one of the higher estimates for that time, so I would go more with 3%, which is a more common estimate for that time period, and would then make the participation of Jews in the International Brigade from America more extreme. It's an interesting historical statistic that Jewish people were so disproportionately passionate about communism and opposing any forms of nationalism, at least when it's white, that they would put their lives on the line while organizing so extensively internationally to interfere in the affairs of another country. I would say, given this historical example, combined with the estimates during the civil rights movement, the high concentration of Jewish people in the US, current political polling, and massive Jewish overrepresentation in elite colleges, that Antifa and white-looking BLM activists could potentially be 50% Jewish. I would, in fact, say 25% Jewish is a minimum in this case. Given the historical data I've listed so far, I do not believe that this would be unreasonable. The Jewish brain is still a different size. They poll with a bizarre majority seeking to oppose or weaken white society. They are vastly overrepresented in the elites that are benefiting from anti-white narratives. And as these conditions are similar to past events, I would hold that they are not only the majority at the intellectual top pushing anti-white narratives, they are certainly also on the street increasing crowd sizes and actually doing their violence. Maybe you say at this point, well, not all, just like not all black people would harm you, but not all is meaningless to the extent that you can say that about any group or pattern. You know, not all pit bulls would harm you, but certainly pit bulls will harm more, and we can say all pit bulls are not Cocker Spaniels. So when we get it together, a big group of Cocker Spaniels on one side and pit bulls on another side, we can really guess, on average, exactly how that large group of pit bulls is going to act and exactly how that large group of Cocker Spaniels is going to act. So noticing a dominant trend is very useful, especially in terms of understanding why the West is going through such significant changes. And that's what I largely seek to do in this series, to point out the cultural and genetic separations between European and Jewish people, alongside statistics of overrepresentation and dominant trends where we see them. If we don't see these groups as separate, we really are missing the most glaring discrepancies of power to explain why Western nations are as weaponized against Western people as they are. This is a power of appearance, a very specific deception that we can see happened in history and can keep happening, where the support of policies that weaken and hurt white communities is given the appearance of far more support in the white community than it actually has, providing a deceptive amount of in-group validation for liberal whites. And when the TV cameras are on, the rest of America and the world immigrating into these nations sees far more white people weakening their standing in Western nations than is actuality. If we notice this trend, and if we separate out the Jewish people as non-Christian, even anti-Christian, with their own distinct genetic cluster, them thinking of themselves as a unique ethnicity opposed to us along racial lines actually, then we see that the support for policies and statements that we know are not beneficial for white America are simply not popular in white America. Turn off the TV, especially when the characters are portrayals of white people by Jews, and ignore tons of the protesters that otherwise look white. Then we can alleviate a huge amount of in-group social pressure and the suicidal and self-deprecating appearance presented about us. We can actually favor ourselves for a change. The unfortunate nature of skin color here is that even though Jews have significantly different genes and goals, if we do not differentiate, they can make us appear to outsiders as they wish for us to appear, as well as they can apply group social pressures to convince white people that these are actually popular positions, and that we have any such social morals as they can influence, especially if they have a lot of positions of power. But of course, this video is running longer than I had first intended. There's just so much data out there, so much quantifiable regarding the influence of the Jewish people. but I still have plenty to cover. All this information, and yet you've been well trained to ignore this influence. It's just too blatant, too satirical. Even if I can get a ton of this information from Jewish sources, this training and this level of power is the first part of why the noses dance.
Friday night we'll be drinking Manischewitz, going out to terrorize Goyam. Stomping shaking, screwing chicks as long as we're home by Saturday morning. 'Cause hey, we're the Bruce, sporting and dice, swastika tattoos. We're the boys, the Orthodox Hasidic OGOs. Orthopedic, Dr. Martin's good for waffle making, kicking through the shin. Reputation gained through intimidation. Pacifism no longer tradition.